The afternoon sun was filtering through the tall, narrow windows of the school's music hall, casting long, bright lines across the floor. It was a Tuesday, which meant it was time for the dreaded seating assignments for the Endeavor Term Showcase. The room was buzzing with low energy, a mix of tired students and the smell of floor wax and old instruments. At the front of the room, Professor Vance stood behind a sleek metal music stand. He was a man who took himself very seriously, always dressed in a stiff jacket that seemed to restrict his movement, and he had a way of looking at students that made them feel like they were already disappointing him. He tapped his pen against the metal stand. Tap, tap, tap. The sound cut through the whispers, and the room went silent. He didn't like wasting time, and he certainly didn't like surprises. He believed that a student's place in the musical world was decided the moment they walked in, and he rarely changed his mind. "All right, settle down," Professor Vance said, his voice sharp and commanding. "Today we decide who plays what for the gala. I have made my choices based on your progress, your discipline, and your ability to handle pressure. If I have placed you on a simple piece, it is because you need to focus on your basics. If I have placed you on a complex piece, it is because you need to step up." He began reading down the list. He called out the names of the seniors first, giving them the flashy, fast solos that everyone wanted. They nodded and smiled, looking confident. Then he moved to the juniors, assigning them ensemble pieces and background music. The tension in the room slowly shifted as the list got shorter and shorter. Finally, only one person remained unseen. At the very back of the room, sitting in a plastic chair that had seen better days, was a girl named Anna. She was new to the school, having transferred in only 2 months ago. She kept to herself mostly, wearing oversized sweaters that seemed to swallow her hands and keeping her hair tied back in a messy knot. She rarely spoke in class, and when she did, her voice was so quiet that people often asked her to repeat herself. To the other students, she was a ghost, someone who was there, but not really there. She was just the quiet girl who carried her sheet music in a battered folder and always left the moment the bell rang. Professor Vance looked down at his clipboard, then peered over his glasses, scanning the room until his eyes landed on the back corner. "Anna," he said. Anna looked up, her eyes wide. She didn't say anything, but she straightened her posture slightly. "You have been a mystery to me," Professor Vance continued, folding his arms. "You don't participate. You don't volunteer for the extra practice sessions. You do the bare minimum to get by. But I see potential in your hands. I see the way you hold them over the keys when you think no one is watching. You have the span for difficult chords." The students around her shifted in their seats, glancing back at her with mild curiosity. They knew what was coming. Professor Vance had a reputation for being tough, but sometimes in his arrogance, he made mistakes. He liked to play games with the new students, throwing them into the deep end to see if they would sink or swim. A boy sitting 2 rows in front of her, a talented pianist named David, turned around. He looked at Anna with a sympathetic grimace. He knew the repertoire list better than anyone. He had been hoping to get the piece he suspected was coming. He whispered to the girl next to him, "She's going to crash and burn." Professor Vance picked up a thick booklet of sheet music from his desk and held it up. "I am assigning you Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, the first movement." A collective gasp went through the room. It wasn't just a gasp of surprise. It was a gasp of horror. This was not a high school piece. This was a monster of a composition, filled with crashing chords, rapid octave changes, and an emotional depth that required a lifetime of experience to master. It was the kind of piece that made professional pianists sweat. "Sir," a brave girl in the front row raised her hand. Isn't that a bit advanced for a transfer student?" Professor Vance shot her a look that silenced her immediately. "Music is not about what is advanced or easy. It is about what is inside you," he said, turning his gaze back to Anna. "Perhaps this will force you to come out of your shell. Perhaps you need a real challenge to understand what this school is about. You have 3 weeks. Do not embarrass us." He walked down the aisle and placed the heavy booklet on the music stand in front of Anna, the thump of the book hitting the plastic stand seemed to echo in the quiet room. "Study it well," Professor Vance said. then turned and walked back to the front, dismissing the class. "That is all. Get out of here!" The room erupted into noise as students grabbed their bags and instruments. David walked past Anna on his way out, shaking his head. He didn't say anything mean, but his expression said enough. He felt sorry for her. He thought the professor was being cruel. Anna sat still for a long moment after everyone else had left. The room was empty now, save for the distant sound of a trumpet playing down the hall. She looked down at the glossy cover of the sheet music. Rachmaninoff, just seeing the name printed there made her heart hammer against her ribs. The students thought she was doomed because she was quiet. They thought she was a novice because she never raised her hand. They saw a shy girl in a baggy sweater who couldn't possibly handle the pressure. Professor Vance thought he was playing a cruel trick on her, testing a weak student to prove a point about discipline. They had no idea. Anna reached out and traced the black letters on the cover with her thumb. She didn't look terrified. She didn't look like someone who had just been handed a death sentence. She took a slow, deep breath, and under the messy hair and the oversized clothes, her shoulders relaxed. Her eyes, which had been wide and darting just a moment before, suddenly grew focused. If anyone had stayed behind to watch her closely, they might have noticed something strange. They might have noticed the way her left hand gently tapped a rhythm on her Naya rhythm that perfectly matched the complex time signature of the piece's introduction. They might have noticed that she didn't look at the sheet music with confusion, but with the familiarity of an old friend she hadn't seen in years. Anna stood up. Sliding the heavy music book into her worn backpack, she swung the bag over her shoulder, the weight of it comforting her. As she walked toward the glass doors that led out of the music hall, a small, almost invisible smile touched her lips. The professor wanted a challenge. He wanted to force her to play. He thought he was setting her up for a failure in front of the whole school. He had no idea that the girl hiding in the back of the class wasn't hiding because she was scared. She was hiding because she was tired. She picked up her pace, walking out into the bright hallway, leaving the silent practice rooms behind. The game was on now, but the joke wasn't on Anna. It was on everyone who had underestimated the quiet girl in the corner. She had 3 weeks, and for the first time in a long time, she was actually looking forward to playing. The school building was nearly empty by the time Anna made her way to the practice rooms. The echoes of shouting students in the hallways had faded, replaced by the low hum of the ventilation system. It was that quiet time of day when the light outside turns a deep orange, stretching long shadows across the linoleum floors. She liked this time better. There were fewer eyes on her, fewer expectations to live up to. She walked down the corridor until she found room 304. It was the smallest room, tucked away in a corner where people rarely went. The door was slightly ajar, and she pushed it open with her shoulder. The air inside smelled of stale coffee and dust. It wasn't a glamorous place to make music, but it was private. Anna dropped her backpack on the floor with a heavy thud. For a moment, she just stood there looking at the piano. It was an upright model, not the grand one they had on the stage. The ivory keys were a little yellow with age, and one of the pedals stuck when you pushed it too hard. It was an old, tired instrument, much like she felt. She sat down on the bench and pulled out the thick booklet Professor Vance had given her. The black cover seemed to stare back at her. She placed it on the music rack and opened it to the first page. Even before she touched a key, the notes on the page began to dance in her mind. She could hear the opening chords, the deep, rolling C minor chords that start the piece like heavy tolling bells. Most people looked at sheet music and saw dots and lines. Anna didn't see that. She saw colors. She saw shapes. She saw a story. But this specific story was one she had tried very hard to forget. Anna closed her eyes and let her hands rest in her lap. The silence of the room pressed against her ears. If she concentrated hard enough, she could almost pretend she was back in her old life. Before the move, before the money problems, before her father got sick, in her old life, music wasn't a hobby. It was her entire world. Her parents had hired the best tutors in the city. She practiced for hours a day, every single day, starting before she was even old enough to reach the pedals properly. Back then, She wasn't Anna, the quiet transfer student. She was the prodigy. The audiences would clap until their hands hurt, and the judges would give her perfect scores. She remembered playing this very piece, Rachmaninoff's Second Concerto, in a packed theater when she was only 12 years old. She remembered the heavy velvet curtains, the smell of expensive perfume, and the way her heart had pounded with excitement rather than fear. Her father had been in the front row, beaming with pride. That night, she hadn't just played the notes. She had poured her soul into them. But then, everything had changed. The economy crashed, her father's business failed, and the stress made his illness return 10 times worse. They lost the big house. They lost the piano. They moved to this small town to start over. Leaving the glittering world of competitions behind, Anna promised herself then that she was done with performing. She was done with the pressure to be perfect. She just wanted to be a normal kid. She wanted to go to school, come home, maybe listen to music without having to worry about hitting every single note correctly. She wanted to hide her talent because her talent reminded her of everything she had lost. She opened her eyes and looked at the keys again. Professor Vance thought he was being cruel. He thought he was giving a piece of music to a girl who couldn't handle it. He saw a shy student who needed to be taught a lesson. He had no idea that by assigning this piece, he was waking up a sleeping giant. Anna reached out and placed her right hand on the keys. Her fingers were long and slender, the fingers of a pianist. She flexed them, feeling the joints crack slightly. She was terrified. If she started playing this, if she let the sound out, would she be able to stop? Would the old obsession come back? Would she turn back into that girl who cared more about music than people? She hesitated. The smart thing to do would be to play it poorly. To fumble through it, show Professor Vance that it was too hard, and ask for an easier piece. Then she could go back to being invisible. But her fingers didn't want to fumble. She took a deep, shaky breath. She didn't press the keys down with force. Instead, she pressed the soft pedal with her foot and touched the keys very gently. A sound came out, but it was like a ghost. It was a whisper of the music, quiet and muffled. She played the first few chords. Dum, dum, dum. The sound was so soft that it was barely audible in the small room. But the moment she heard it, something shifted inside her chest. It was like meeting an old friend on the street you thought you would never see again. Her fingers moved to the next measure, and then the next. They knew where to go. They didn't need her eyes to read the notes. They just knew she wasn't reading the music. She was remembering it. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away. She played through the first page with the soft pedal down, choking the sound, keeping it trapped inside the piano. It felt like she was holding back a scream. The music wanted to be loud. It wanted to roar and crash against the walls. But Anna wouldn't let it. She kept it quiet, tame, and controlled. She played for an hour like that, barely making a sound, sweat beading on her forehead. It was the hardest practice session she had ever done. It took more strength to hold the music back than it would have to let it out. Finally, she pulled her hands away from the keys. They were trembling. She looked at the clock on the wall. She had missed her bus. She would have to walk home. She packed up her bag, a heavy booklet weighing her down again. As she walked out of the practice room and into the dark hallway, she didn't feel like the prodigy she used to be, and she didn't feel like the quiet student she pretended to be. She felt like someone standing on a bridge, looking down at the water, wondering if she should jump. The recital was 3 weeks away. She had to decide who she was going to be when she walked out on that stage. Was she going to be Anna, the failure? Or was she going to let the world hear the music she had been suppressing for so long? She closed the door to room 304 gently, cutting off the smell of dust and old coffee. The hallway was dark, and her footsteps were the only sound as she headed toward the exit. The game had changed. Professor Vance had thrown a match into a pile of dry leaves, and now the fire was starting to burn. The next 2 weeks were a blur of frustration and tension. The school days felt longer than usual, dragging on as if the clock on the wall was moving through thick syrup. Every time Anna walked into the music hall, she could feel the eyes of the other students on her. The news travels fast in a high school, and everyone knew by now that Professor Vance had assigned the hardest piece of the year to the quiet new girl. Most of the students didn't say anything to her face, but she could hear the whispers when she walked past. They felt sorry for her, but in a way that was more about themselves than her. They were glad it wasn't them. They knew how demanding the professor could be, and they secretly thought she was going to crash and burn. Even David, the talented pianist who had felt bad for her on the first day, stopped making eye contact. It was like watching a car accident in slow motion. No one wanted to look too closely. Professor Vance was becoming increasingly impatient. He ran the rehearsals like a military drill. He would stand in the center of the room with his arms crossed, his foot tapping out a strict rhythm. He expected perfection, and he usually got it from his top students. But with Anna, he was getting silence. Again, Professor Vance barked, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. It was Thursday afternoon, and the class was gathered for a run-through of the ensemble pieces. Anna was sitting at the piano, her hands poised over the keys. She was supposed to play the introduction to the Rachmaninoff piece while the rest of the class listened. She took a breath and pressed down on the keys. But it wasn't the powerful sound the music needed. It was weak and shaky. She was playing with the soft pedal-on, a mechanism on the piano that muffled the sound to make it whisper quiet. She had been doing this for every practice. The notes were correct, her timing was perfect, but the volume was barely a whisper. It sounded like a mouse scratching on the wall instead of a thunderstorm. Professor Vance marched over to the piano. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. "Stop," he commanded. Anna's hands froze. She could feel her heart beating in her throat. "I have given you the most passionate, loud, and demanding piece in the repertoire," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "And you are playing it like you are afraid the piano will bite you. Where is the power, Anna? Where is the emotion?" "I'm working on it, sir," she stammered, keeping her eyes on the keys. "You are hiding," he snapped, standing up straight and addressing the whole room. "This is what happens when we try to take shortcuts. You cannot hide behind technicality. You must project. The audience needs to feel the music in their chest." He turned back to her. "Take that foot off the pedal. Play it again, properly." Anna hesitated. The muscles in her hands were tense. If she played it properly, if she really let go, she knew what would happen. The dam would break. She would reveal the skills she had spent years trying to bury. But the professor was staring at her, and the whole class was watching. She couldn't just refuse. She lifted her foot off the soft pedal. She took a breath and struck the opening chords. Bam! The sound was loud, much louder than she intended. It resonated through the room, vibrating the floorboards. For a split second, it was magnificent. It was the sound of a professional. But just as quickly as it started, Anna panicked. She pulled her hands back, messing up the next few notes, cutting the sound short. The beautiful moment turned into a jumble of wrong keys and awkward silence. The room went dead silent. Professor Vance stared at her, his eyebrows raised in shock. He had heard that split second of perfection, and then he had heard it fall apart. He didn't know what to make of it. "See?" he said finally, rubbing his temples. "You rush. You panic. You have no control. You are not ready for this stage." He dismissed the class a few minutes later, clearly disappointed. Anna gathered her things slowly, keeping her head down. As she walked toward the door, she passed David. He looked at her with a mix of confusion and pity. "You almost had it there for a second," he whispered quietly. "That first chord was really good." "What happened?" Anna didn't answer. She just tightened her grip on her bag and walked out into the hallway. She felt like a fraud. She was lying to her teacher. She was lying to her classmates. And worst of all, she was lying to herself. She was pretending to be a bad student to protect her secret. But the secret was dying to get out. That night, the atmosphere in her small apartment was heavy. It wasn't just the pressure at school. It was home, too. The financial strain was getting worse. The kitchen table was piled high with unopened bills and final notices. Her father sat at the table with his head in his hands, looking exhausted. He looked older than he had a few months ago. The stress was etched into his face. Anna poured him a cup of coffee and placed it gently beside his elbow. He looked up and tried to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "How was school, honey?" he asked, his voice tired. It was okay, Anna said, sitting down across from him. She wanted to tell him about the piano. She wanted to tell him about the professor and the difficult piece and how hard it was to hold back. But she couldn't. Talking about the piano would remind him of the life they used to have, the life where she was a star and they had money. It would just be another painful reminder of what they had lost. The music program is intense, she said vaguely. Her father sighed and took a sip of coffee. Just do your best, Anna. That's all anyone can ask. We're lucky you're in such a good school. Just keep your head down and stay out of trouble. Anna nodded, her throat tight. I will, Dad. Keep your head down. That was the advice she lived by. But the music in her head was getting louder. The Rachmaninoff piece was constantly playing in her mind now, even when she wasn't at the piano. It was like a radio she couldn't turn off. She could hear the sweeping melodies and the crashing crescendos in the shower. In her sleep, while she walked to school, she walked into her bedroom and closed the door. Her room was simple. There were no trophies on the shelves, no ribbons on the walls. She had made sure of that. But under her bed, hidden inside an old shoebox, were a few faded photographs from her old life. She pulled the box out and looked at them. There was one of her standing on a big stage, holding a trophy, surrounded by lights. She looked so happy, so confident. She looked at her hands now. They were the same hands. They hadn't changed. The skill was still there, buried under layers of fear and the desire to be normal. She realized she couldn't keep doing this. She couldn't keep playing the ghost. Professor Vance was right about one thing. Music was about sharing. By holding back, she wasn't just disobeying her teacher. She was disrespecting the music itself. She was disrespecting the talent she had been given. Tomorrow was the dress rehearsal. It was the last chance to play before the big night. Anna knew she couldn't play soft anymore. She couldn't play scared. She had to make a choice. She could either fail on purpose and stay in the shadows, or she could step into the light and show them who she really was. She put the photos back in the box and slid it under the bed. She lay down on her blanket and stared at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. In her mind, she played the piece perfectly, note for note, loud and clear. She let the music fill her up until she felt like she was floating. For the first time in 2 years, she wasn't afraid of the sound. She was ready. The night of the big recital had finally arrived. The school auditorium was packed, filled with parents, teachers, and students who had come to watch the end-of-term showcase. The air in the room was thick with heat and excitement. The stage lights were turned up high, beaming down onto the glossy black grand piano that sat center stage. It looked like a polished gem in the middle of a sea of dark curtains. Backstage, the atmosphere was chaotic, but quiet. Students were tuning instruments, adjusting their uniforms, and nervously shuffling their sheet music. Anna stood in the corner away from the main group. She was wearing a simple black dress she had found at a thrift store. It wasn't fancy like the velvet gowns some of the other girls were wearing, but it was clean, and it allowed her to move freely. She looked down at her hands. They were shaking slightly. She took a deep breath and held them against her sides to steady them. She felt different today. The fear that had been weighing her down for weeks felt lighter, replaced by a strange sense of calm. She had spent the afternoon visualizing the performance, playing every note in her mind until she knew them better than she knew her own name. Professor Vance walked by, clipboard in hand. He stopped in front of her. He looked stressed, his tie loosened and his hair slightly messy. "Don't forget what we discussed," he said in a low voice, not looking her in the eye. "Projection, control. If you get lost, just stop and wait for the beat. Don't panic." "I won't panic, sir," Anna said softly. He looked at her for a second, perhaps surprised by the confidence in her voice, but he just nodded and moved on to check on the cello section. The curtain rose, and the first group of students went out to play. The audience clapped politely. Anna watched from the wings. She saw David play a complex Mozart sonata. He played well, but he missed a few notes in the fast section. The audience clapped anyway, but David walked off stage shaking his head, frustrated. Being a musician was hard. Perfection was almost impossible to catch. Then, it was time for the final performance of the night. And now, the announcer's voice boomed over the speakers. To close our program, we have a special performance of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, First Movement, performed by Anna. There was a murmur of surprise through the crowd. The parents who knew music looked at each other. They knew how hard that piece was. The other students stopped whispering and leaned forward to watch. Professor Vance stood at the side of the stage, holding his breath. Anna walked out into the bright lights. The heat hit her face instantly, blinding her to the faces of the crowd. She couldn't see the people anymore. She just saw a wall of darkness beyond the glare. She walked to the piano, her steps steady and rhythmic. The sound of her shoes on the wooden floor was the only sound in the room. She sat down on the bench. She adjusted the height, something she did automatically without thinking. She reached up to pull the music stand closer, but then she stopped. She looked at the sheet music sitting there, open to the first page. It was a security blanket, something to hold on to in case she forgot where she was, but she didn't need it. She knew this piece. She had lived this piece. With a calm motion, she closed the music book and pushed it to the side of the piano. A quiet gasp went through the students backstage. Even Professor Vance raised his eyebrows. Playing from memory was something only the seniors dared to do. Anna placed her hands in her lap. She closed her eyes for just a moment. She blocked out the heat, the noise, the expectation. She remembered the dusty practice room and the smell of her old home. She remembered the feeling of the keys when she was a child. She wasn't a student anymore. She was a musician. She opened her eyes. Her expression changed completely. The shy, slumped posture vanished. Her back straightened like a rod of iron. Her hands rose from her lap and hovered over the keys, strong and ready. She didn't tap them gently. She struck the first chord with incredible force. Bam! The sound exploded into the room like a cannon shot. It was so loud and so deep that the audience physically jumped in their seats. The vibration rattled the floorboards before the sound could fade. Her left hand crashed down on the second chord, then the third. The opening bells of the concerto rang out, heavy and ominous. She wasn't just playing the notes. She was attacking them. She was pulling the sound out of the piano with a ferocity that was terrifying to watch. Professor Vance froze. His mouth opened slightly. The girl he thought was a timid amateur was hitting the keys with the power of a concertmaster. Then came the fast notes. Her right hand began to move, flying up and down the keyboard in a blur of motion. The speed was impossible, inhuman. Her fingers danced over the keys with absolute precision, landing on every note with a sharp, crystal-clear tone. There were no mistakes. There was no hesitation. The audience sat in stunned silence. No one coughed. No one shifted in their seats. They were paralyzed by the sound. The music was intense. It started dark and heavy, full of sadness and anger. Anna's face showed the emotion. She wasn't smiling. She was focused with an intensity that was almost scary. She swayed slightly with the rhythm, her body connected to the instrument. She was playing the story of her lost life, of the pain her father felt, of the struggle to start over. She poured all the months of silence and hiding into the sound. The music became a voice for everything she had been holding back. She moved through the difficult sections, parts where the chords jump across the entire length of the keyboard. Most students had to stretch and strain to reach them, but Anna's hands made it look easy. Her fingers spanned the distances effortlessly, her arms moving with a fluid grace. As the piece built toward the climax, the volume grew. The piano was singing now, screaming with a beautiful, piercing melody that soared above the heavy bass notes. The sound filled every corner of the vast hall. It bounced off the walls and the ceiling, filling the air with electricity. In the back row, a father whispered to his wife, "Who is this kid? I thought she was a beginner." On stage, Anna was lost in the storm. She wasn't thinking about the notes anymore. Her hands were moving on their own, guided by years of training and a raw, natural talent that refused to be hidden. She felt a rush of adrenaline like she had never felt before. This was where she belonged. Not in the back of the class, not hiding in a sweater, but right here, in the center of the storm. She reached the final cascade of notes, the chaotic tumbling run that leads to the last, dramatic chords. Her hands were a blur, a whirlwind of sound. She slammed the final chords out, one after another. Each one stronger than the last, then silence. She lifted her hands off the keys and held them in the air for a split second, freezing the moment. The echoes of the final chord hung in the hall, vibrating, ringing in everyone's ears. The stage lights shimmered around her. She slowly lowered her hands to her lap and sat still, her chest heaving slightly. The auditorium remained dead silent for 3 full seconds. It was the kind of silence that happens when people are so shocked they forget how to breathe. Professor Vance had dropped his clipboard on the floor. He didn't even notice. He was just staring, his face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. Anna sat there, alone on the stage, the quiet girl who had just roared like a lion. For 3 seconds, the silence in the auditorium was absolute. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air is holding its breath. The last vibration of the piano note had faded into the rafters, leaving nothing but the ghost of the sound hanging in the air. Anna sat still on the bench, her hands resting in her lap, her chest rising and falling as she caught her breath. She didn't move. She just stared at the keys, almost as if she was surprised they were still there. From the darkness of the wings, Professor Vance stood frozen. His clipboard lay on the floor at his feet, forgotten. He had prepared a speech in his head about handling failure, about how to learn from a difficult experience. But looking at the stage now, he realized that speech was dust. The girl he had criticized for being timid, the student he had pitied for being out of her depth, had just played with more soul and power than any senior he had taught in 10 years. He felt a strange mix of shock and shame, realizing he had been blind to the greatness sitting in the back row. Then the spell broke. A man in the 5th row stood up. He was a parent who knew nothing about music theory, but he knew what he liked. He started clapping, slowly at first, then harder. Within moments, the entire auditorium erupted. It wasn't the polite, obligatory clapping that usually followed a student recital. It was a roar. People were on their feet. Whistles pierced the air. Students from the music program rushed to the edge of the stage, their eyes wide, screaming her name. David, the talented pianist who had looked at her with pity just days before, was clapping so hard his palms were stinging. A huge grin stretched across his face. Anna looked up, blinking against the bright lights. She couldn't see their faces clearly, but she could feel the energy washing over her. It was warm and loud and overwhelming. She stood up slowly. She felt a bit dizzy, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was the rush of adrenaline. She walked to the center of the stage and gave a small, awkward bow. It wasn't a practiced, graceful bow like the ones in her old life. It was just a quick nod of gratitude, but the crowd screamed even louder. Backstage, the atmosphere had completely shifted. As Anna walked off the stage, wiping sweat from her forehead, her classmates didn't ignore her. They swarmed her. That was insane. A girl holding a violin shouted, "I didn't know you could play like that." "You were holding out on us," David said, laughing as he high-fived her. He looked at her with new respect. "Professor Vance is literally pale. I think you broke his brain." Anna tried to smile, but she felt tears pricking her eyes. She wasn't used to this attention. For months, she had been invisible, a background character in her own life. Now she was the main character, and it was terrifying but also incredibly freeing. She had shown them who she was, and they hadn't rejected her. They had celebrated her. She finally found her father near the exit. He was standing still, holding his coat, staring at her with a look of total disbelief. He had missed the bus because he wanted to make sure he was on time, and he had seen everything. "Dad," Anna said, walking up to him. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in years. He saw not just his daughter, who did her homework and kept her head down, but the artist she had been hiding. The stress lines on his face seemed to soften. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I thought you gave it all up." I thought you didn't want it anymore. I didn't want the pressure, Dad," Anna said softly. I just wanted to be us. But tonight, it just felt right. He reached out and pulled her into a hug. It wasn't a quick hug. It was a long, tight hug, the kind they hadn't shared in a long time. You were amazing, he whispered into her hair. I am so proud of you. Not because of the music, but because you got up there and owned it. The next day at school, things were different, yet somehow they were also the same. The hallways still smelled of floor wax, and the bells still rang at the same time. But as Anna walked to her locker, people stopped to smile at her. Strangers said hello. The quiet girl label was gone, replaced by something else. When she walked into the music hall for her regular lesson, the room went quiet again. But this time, no one was looking at her with pity. They were waiting to see what she would do next. Professor Vance was sitting at his desk. He looked tired, but he was waiting for her. He waved his hand, signaling for her to come to his office. Anna walked in, clutching her backpack strap. She prepared herself for a lecture. Maybe he would be mad that she lied by omission, that she made him look bad for underestimating her. Professor Vance took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He looked at her for a long moment. Anna, he said, I have been teaching for 20 years. I pride myself on being able to see a student's potential within the first week. Anna didn't say anything. She just waited. And I failed completely with you, he admitted, leaning back in his chair. I saw a shy student who needed a push. I didn't see a master who needed a stage. You played that piece better than I have ever heard it played. The emotion, it was raw. It was real. Thank you, sir, Anna said quietly. I don't know what your story is, and I don't need to know right now, he continued. But you have a gift that cannot be wasted in the back of the room. If you are willing, I want to work with you. Not as a punishment, and not as a challenge. I want to teach you because you have something to say, and the world needs to hear it. Anna felt a warmth spread through her chest. She hadn't realized how much she wanted to hear those words until he said them. She realized that hiding her talent hadn't just been hiding her skill. It had been hiding a part of her soul. I would like that, she said, a genuine smile spreading across her face. Good, Professor Vance said, standing up. Then for next week, I want you to look at the third movement. But this time, don't hide in the practice room with the soft pedal. Play it like you mean it. Anna walked out of the office and headed toward her favorite spot in the practice room hallway. She passed by students she recognized, and for the first time, she didn't look down at her shoes. She looked them in the eye and smiled. She walked into room 304. The room was still dusty, and the piano was still the same old upright model with the sticky pedal. But to Anna, it looked different. It wasn't a coffin for her secrets anymore. It was a tool. She sat down on the bench. She didn't have sheet music with her. She didn't need it. She placed her hands on the keys. She didn't hesitate. She didn't play softly. She struck the keys with confidence, letting the sound ring out clearly, filling the small room with music. She was no longer the prodigy who had lost everything, and she wasn't the shy transfer student pretending to be average. She was Anna, a musician who had found her voice again, and she was just getting started.